The courtroom was filled with tension. At the defense table sat David Langley, a high-profile attorney known for his sharp tongue and ruthless tactics. He had never lost a case, and he didn't plan to start now. Across the room, a man in a faded gray jumpsuit quietly pushed a mop along the tiled floor. The janitor. Most people barely noticed him. Just another invisible worker, cleaning up after the important people. But David Langley noticed, and he saw an opportunity for mockery. Langley stood and adjusted his expensive suit, his confidence oozing from every movement. He turned toward the jury, flashing his signature charming smirk. "Your Honor, I'm amazed at the quality of witnesses we're bringing in today," he said sarcastically. He gestured toward the janitor. "I mean, are we taking testimony from custodians now?" A few people in the courtroom chuckled. The janitor paused mid-mop, his face unreadable. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Watch yourself, Mr. Langley." But Langley wasn't done. He turned toward the janitor, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sir, do you even understand the legal system? Or do you just wipe floors?" Laughter rippled through the gallery. Langley grinned, satisfied. But the janitor? He simply set his mop aside. Then he smirked. And in the next few moments, David Langley's world was about to turn upside down. The janitor didn't move right away. He simply folded his hands, watching David Langley with an amused expression, as if the joke wasn't on him, but on the lawyer. Langley raised an eyebrow. "What's the matter?" he taunted. "You got nothing to say now?" The janitor sighed. Then, in a calm voice, he said something that stunned the entire courtroom. "I suppose I should introduce myself properly." Langley's smirk flickered. The janitor walked over to the witness stand and looked at Judge Reynolds. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge, intrigued, nodded. "Go ahead." The janitor turned back to Langley. "My name is Doctor." Thomas Bernard Langley's smirk vanished. Murmurs spread across the courtroom. But Dr. Bernard wasn't done. "I hold a Ph.D. in constitutional law. I was a tenured professor at Harvard for 15 years. I've written 3 books on legal ethics, and I've trained some of the very judges who sit on the bench today." The courtroom went dead silent. Langley's face drained of color. Dr. Bernard leaned forward. "I was also your professor, Mr. Langley." Gasps erupted from the audience. Langley stumbled back, his arrogance crumbling. He remembered now. Dr. Bernard. The brilliant, no-nonsense professor who had taught him everything he knew about the law. The professor he had ignored. Dr. Bernard smirked. "I retired early due to personal reasons, but I took this janitorial job because I enjoy being around the courtroom. You know, watching young lawyers make fools of themselves." More murmurs of disbelief. Judge Reynolds hid a knowing smile. Langley's hands trembled. He had just mocked one of the greatest legal minds of his time. And now, he was the laughingstock of the courtroom. David Langley's mind raced. This wasn't just a humiliation. This was career-ending. He had mocked a man who had once been one of the most respected legal minds in the country. And now, the entire courtroom knew it. The jury exchanged knowing glances. A few members of the gallery stifled laughter. Even the judge looked mildly entertained. Langley's throat went dry. "Hold on," he stammered, trying to regain control. You're a janitor now. That doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here." Dr. Bernard simply raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Langley, did you forget what courtroom decorum is? I was called as a witness. I have every right to be here." Langley opened his mouth, then closed it, because he knew Dr. Bernard was right. Dr. Bernard turned to the judge. "Your Honor, would you like to hear my expert testimony on legal ethics?" Judge Reynolds chuckled. "By all means." Dr. Bernard folded his hands, his tone calm but lethal. The arrogance Mr. Langley displayed today is a perfect example of how some lawyers believe the law is about ego and power. He turned to the jury. But in reality, the law is about justice, and justice doesn't care about the price of your suit or how many zeros are in your bank account. Langley's face burned red because this wasn't just a lesson. This was his public execution. The jury nodded, visibly swayed. Even Langley's own client looked disappointed. And Langley, he sat down, speechless, because he had lost. Not just the argument, but his reputation. The courtroom was no longer in David Langley's control. He had walked in with arrogance, confidence, and condescension. Now, he sat stiffly in his chair, his face red, his hands clenching the table. Judge Reynolds folded his hands. "Mr. Langley," he said, his voice calm but sharp, "do you understand the gravity of what just happened here?" Langley swallowed. "Your Honor, The judge raised a hand. "Let me be very clear," Reynolds continued. "This court is a place of law and respect. What you displayed today was neither." Langley's stomach twisted, because he knew what was coming next. "Mocking a witness in my courtroom?" Judge Reynolds shook his head. "That alone is unacceptable." He gestured toward Dr. Bernard. "But belittling a man who, unbeknownst to you, was once one of the most respected legal minds in this country, that is beyond foolish." The courtroom murmured. Langley gritted his teeth. "I didn't know." "That," the judge cut in, "see, is exactly the problem." A heavy silence followed. "You assumed," Judge Reynolds continued, "you thought that because this man wore a janitor's uniform, he was beneath you." Langley shrunk in his seat. "But today," the judge said, "you learned a hard lesson about judging people by their appearances." The jury nodded in agreement. Langley's own client shifted uncomfortably, clearly rethinking their choice in legal representation. Dr. Bernard simply smirked, because he had seen this exact arrogance before. And now, it had just cost Langley everything. Judge Reynolds let out a slow breath. "Mr. Langley, consider this your official warning. Another display of arrogance or disrespect in my courtroom, and I will hold you in contempt." Langley's heart pounded, because the message was clear. Today he hadn't just been embarrassed. He had been humbled. David Langley sat rigid in his seat, his face still flushed from humiliation. The once untouchable, smug attorney had just been put in his place, publicly. But his troubles, they weren't over yet. Across the table, Langley's own client, a wealthy businessman named Richard Vance, leaned toward him, his expression furious. "I hired you because you said you were the best," Vance hissed under his breath. "And now you're out here mocking janitors and getting humiliated?" Langley's stomach twisted. "Mr. Vance, I can still—" "No," Vance cut in. "You can't." Then he stood. "Your Honor," he called out, drawing the courtroom's attention. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Mr. Vance?" Vance buttoned his jacket. "I'd like to request a change of counsel, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Langley's heart dropped. His own client was firing him, publicly. Judge Reynolds nodded. "That is within your rights, Mr. Vance. Do you already have a replacement in mind?" Vance smirked. "As a matter of fact, I do." He turned toward Dr. Bernard. The courtroom froze. Langley's breath hitched. "Wait, what?" Dr. Bernard let out a low chuckle. "I'm retired," he said. "But—" He looked Langley dead in the eye. "For the right case, I might make an exception." The jury exchanged amused glances. The gallery, openly whispering. And Langley? He felt his entire career slipping through his fingers. He had mocked a janitor. And now, That same janitor had just taken his job. David Langley had never felt so powerless. The courtroom, the very place where he had always been in control, was now his undoing. And the worst part? He had done it to himself. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Vance, your request for new counsel is granted. Dr. Bernard, if you choose to represent the plaintiff, the court will allow it." Dr. Bernard simply smiled. "I'd be delighted, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed with stunned murmurs. David Langley sat motionless, pale. He had mocked a janitor. And now, that janitor was about to crush him in court. Langley turned back to his now former client. "Mr. Vance, wait. This is a mistake. I can still—" Vance didn't even look at him. "Pack your things, Langley. We're done." Langley's jaw tightened. His career had been built on confidence, power, and intimidation. But now he was just another lawyer who had let arrogance destroy him. The jury watched in silent amusement. The spectators? Some were outright laughing. And the reporters? Oh, they were writing furiously. By tomorrow, every legal blog in the city would be running the same headline: "High-powered lawyer humiliated in court by a janitor." Langley's hands curled into fists. He had come into this courtroom expecting an easy win. Instead, he had been publicly humbled, stripped of his case, and outmatched by the very man he had insulted. Judge Reynolds gave Langley one last look. "You're dismissed, Mr. Langley," he said. "Feel free to mop up your own mess on the way out." Laughter erupted across the room. Langley grabbed his briefcase with shaking hands and stormed toward the exit, his face burning. And behind him, Dr. Bernard simply watched, smiling, because today, justice had been served.